When single mother Rosalind Nakamura paid $400 for what neighbors called the most cursed piece of land in Thornfield County, she had no idea that beneath the overgrown brambles and rotting foundations lay a diamond deposit worth $47 million that would transform her family's future and silence every critic who had mocked her idiotic decision to throw away money on worthless dirt. Before we dive into this incredible journey of discovery that spans betrayal, danger, and vindication, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because the next 9 parts will reveal how one mother's desperate gamble turned mockery into triumph and poverty into generational wealth. The pre-dawn darkness still clung to the hills surrounding Thornfield County as Rosalind Nakamura's battered Toyota Corolla coughed to life in the parking lot of the Sunrise Motel, where she and her 10-year-old daughter Keiko had been living for the past 3 months. The engine's wheeze echoed her own exhaustion. 2 years of working triple shifts as a night shift cleaner at the medical center, weekend shifts at the farmer's market, and whatever odd job she could find had left her running on fumes and caffeine. "Mama, are we really going to see our land today?" Keiko asked from the passenger seat, her voice thick with sleep and the lingering effects of the respiratory infection that had been plaguing her for weeks. Rosalind forced a smile she didn't feel as she navigated the empty streets of downtown Thornfield, past the shuttered storefronts and the 4 lease signs that had multiplied like weeds since the textile mill closed 2 years ago. "Yes, sweetheart. Today we see what we bought with Grandma Emiko's inheritance money." The inheritance had been exactly $847, all that remained after her grandmother's medical bills and funeral expenses had been paid. Rosalind had intended to use it for a deposit on a proper apartment, maybe even get Keiko into a better school district. Instead, she'd blown $400 of it on 43 acres of land that every rational person in Thornfield County considered worthless at best and cursed at worst. The Blackwood property had been abandoned for 18 years, ever since old Magnus Blackwood had died alone in the ramshackle farmhouse with no known heirs. The county had been trying to unload it for back taxes ever since, dropping the asking price year after year as the buildings deteriorated and the land returned to wilderness. When the auction notice finally appeared in the Thornfield Gazette with a minimum bid of $400, the local reaction had been swift and merciless. "That Nakamura woman has finally lost her mind," Dolores Pemberton had announced loudly at Cassidy's General Store, ensuring everyone in the checkout line could hear. "Spending money she don't have on land that ain't worth the paper the deed's printed on. Some people just don't learn." The criticism had been relentless and public. At the unemployment office, the food bank, and the county health clinic, neighbors offered unsolicited opinions about her financial irresponsibility. Vernon Ashworth, who owned the sprawling Ashworth cattle ranch that bordered the Blackwood property, had been particularly vocal at the town hall meeting discussing the auction. "That Blackwood land is cursed," he declared to the packed room, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose family had controlled significant portions of the county for 5 generations. "Nothing good ever came from that property, and nothing good ever will. Magnus Blackwood went crazy living there, talking about voices in the ground and lights in the woods. Whoever's fool enough to buy that land is asking for trouble." Rosalind had sat in the back row, face burning with humiliation as heads turned in her direction. Everyone in town knew she was the only person who'd expressed interest in the property, mainly because she was the only person desperate enough to consider it. But Rosalind had reasons that went deeper than desperation, rooted in stories her grandmother Emiko had whispered to her during long winter nights when money was tight and the heating bill remained unpaid. Emiko had worked as a domestic servant for Magnus Blackwood's father in the 1930s and 1940s, cleaning the big house and tending the gardens during the height of the family's prosperity. "There were stones," Emiko had told young Rosalind, her weathered hands tracing patterns in the air as if she could still see them. "Magnus's father made me swear never to speak of them, said they were family secrets that could bring danger if the wrong people learned about them." Rosalind's mother had dismissed these stories as the confused memories of an elderly woman whose mind was slipping. "Your grandmother worked too hard for too many years," she said when Rosalind brought up the mysterious stones. "All those cleaning chemicals probably affected her brain. You can't base life decisions on the fantasies of someone who wasn't thinking clearly." The bank loan officer had been equally discouraging when Rosalind inquired about financing the purchase. "Miss Nakamura, while $400 isn't a substantial amount in absolute terms, your current financial situation makes any unnecessary expenditure inadvisable. You're already 3 months behind on various bills, and taking on property taxes and maintenance obligations for a property with no apparent value seems, he paused, searching for a polite way to say stupid, counterproductive. Rosalind's financial situation was indeed dire. Her cleaning job at Thornfield Regional Medical Center paid $11 an hour for overnight shifts that left her exhausted and unable to pursue better opportunities during normal business hours. Weekend work at the farmer's market selling homemade pickles and preserves brought in maybe $50 on a good weekend. Various odd jobs, house cleaning, elderly care, seasonal work at the Christmas tree farm, provided sporadic income that never quite covered their basic needs. Keiko's chronic asthma required medications that cost more than Rosalind's weekly grocery budget, and their shared room at the Sunrise Motel ran $280 per week, more than many people paid for entire apartments, but the only option available to someone without first and last month's rent deposits or acceptable credit references. But there had been something in her grandmother's stories that Rosalind couldn't dismiss, a consistency and specificity that felt different from typical elderly confusion. Keiko had drawn detailed maps of the property, marking the location of the mysterious stones with precision that suggested clear memory rather than fantasy. She'd kept one of the stones hidden in her jewelry box until her death, a small, unusually hard crystal that seemed to bend light in ways that regular rocks didn't. More importantly, Keiko's diary, written in a mixture of English and Japanese characters, contained entries that corroborated her spoken stories. One entry, dated July 15, 1941, had particularly caught Rosalind's attention. Found more firestones today near the lightning-struck oak by the Southern Creek. Mr. Blackwood became very angry when he discovered me examining them. Made me promise on my mother's grave to forget what I had seen. But I remember everything. Someday, someone will need to know. The night before the auction, Rosalind had sat on the narrow bed in their motel room, holding her grandmother's stone in one hand and the diary in the other, while Keiko slept fitfully beside her, wheezing despite the inhaler. The decision to bid on the Blackwood property had crystallized not from greed or desperation, but from a bone-deep conviction that her grandmother had been trying to leave them something more valuable than memories. The auction had been sparsely attended. Just Rosalind, a handful of curiosity seekers, and Vernon Ashworth, who'd come to witness what he later described as the most spectacular waste of money since the county built that bridge to nowhere. The auctioneer, a thin man named Fitzpatrick, who looked uncomfortable with the entire proceeding, had seemed almost embarrassed to be selling property that everyone knew was worthless. Ladies and gentlemen, we have the Blackwood property, 43 acres with existing structures, minimum bid $400, he had announced, his voice lacking its usual theatrical flair. Do I hear 400? Rosalind had raised her hand, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes in the room settling on her like a physical burden. 400 to the young lady in the back. Do I hear 450? A long, uncomfortable silence. Anyone? 425? More silence. Hearing no other bids, sold for $400 to, he consulted his paperwork, Rosalind Nakamura. Vernon Ashworth had shaken his head in disgust as he left, muttering loud enough for everyone to hear. Some people got more money than sense, even when they ain't got much of either. The paperwork had been completed within 30 minutes, and Rosalind found herself the owner of 43 acres of cursed land that had consumed nearly half of her grandmother's modest inheritance. Now, 5 days later, she was finally making her first visit to the property as its legal owner, trying to see it through her grandmother's eyes rather than through the lens of communal ridicule and her own mounting anxiety about having made the biggest financial mistake of her life. The drive took 40 minutes on winding country roads that became progressively narrower and more poorly maintained as they left the town center behind. Dawn was breaking as they turned onto the overgrown dirt track that served as the property's driveway. Rosalind's Toyota struggling with the deep ruts and washouts that hadn't been repaired in decades. The first glimpse of the Blackwood farmhouse made Keiko gasp with a mixture of fascination and alarm. The two-story structure sat in a clearing surrounded by towering pine trees, its white paint long since weathered to gray, its wraparound porch sagging under the weight of a partially collapsed roof. Windows stared like empty eye sockets, their glass long since broken or boarded over. Vines had claimed the entire east wall, transforming the building into something that looked more grown than built. "It's like a haunted house from the movies," Keiko whispered, pressing her face against the car window. "It just needs some attention," Rosalind replied, though her heart sank as she surveyed the magnitude of the restoration that would be required to make the structure habitable. Beyond the farmhouse, she could see the remains of other buildings, a barn with its roof completely collapsed, a chicken coop that had returned to its component lumber, and several outbuildings that were little more than foundations overgrown with brambles and saplings. But as they drove deeper onto the property, following what had once been a service road, Rosalind began to see the land through different eyes. 43 acres of rolling hills covered with native grasses and wildflowers. A year-round creek that sparkled in the morning sunlight, fed by springs that bubbled up from the limestone bedrock. Mature oak trees that provided natural windbreaks and shade. And somewhere in this seemingly abandoned landscape, if her grandmother's stories were true, evidence of something valuable that had been deliberately concealed for the better part of a century. The lightning-struck oak that Emiko had described in her diary was easy to locate. A massive tree near the southern boundary of the property, its trunk split down the middle by some long-ago storm, but still very much alive, each half reaching skyward like enormous arms embracing the morning sky. "Mama, look at this tree," Keiko called, running toward the distinctive landmark. "It's like it got hit by lightning but didn't want to die." Rosalind followed her daughter toward the creek that meandered through the property, its banks lined with smooth stones and fallen logs that created natural dams and swimming holes. The water was clearer than she'd expected, running over a bed of varied stones that ranged from typical creek gravel to larger, more unusual specimens. "Mom, these rocks are really pretty," Keiko said, wading into the shallow water near the lightning-struck oak. "Look, some of them are like crystals or something." Rosalind knelt beside her daughter and examined the stones Keiko was collecting. They were indeed different from ordinary creek rocks, harder, more angular, with internal structures that seemed to capture and reflect light in unusual ways. Some were no larger than pebbles, while others were nearly the size of golf balls, all sharing a distinctive crystalline quality that reminded her immediately of the stone her grandmother had preserved. "Let's gather some of these," Rosalind said, her pulse quickening with recognition and possibility. "I want to have them examined by someone who knows about rocks and minerals." They spent 2 hours collecting specimens from the creek bed, focusing on the area near the lightning-struck oak where the unusual stones seemed most concentrated. The pattern suggested they'd been washed down from somewhere higher in the hills, concentrated by the creek's flow into natural collection points along the banks. As they worked, Rosalind became increasingly convinced that her grandmother's stories weren't fantasies of an aging mind, but suppressed memories of a discovery that had been deliberately concealed for the better part of a century. That afternoon, after returning to the motel and getting Keiko settled with her homework, Rosalind drove to the Thornfield Public Library and spent hours researching the geological history of their region. What she discovered made her grandmother's stories seem less like folklore and more like suppressed historical truth. Thornfield County sat on the edge of an ancient geological formation known as the Carolina Slate Belt, an area that had undergone intense pressure and mineral formation over millions of years. The region was part of a larger geological zone that included some of North Carolina's most productive diamond mines, although most of the information about local mineral deposits seemed to have been restricted or removed from public records. An 1889 newspaper article from the Thornfield Gazette mentioned significant mineral discoveries on several properties in the county, noting that Eastern mining interests had acquired the rights to most of the productive sites. Another reference, from a 1923 geological survey, described commercially viable diamond deposits in the southern portion of the county, but noted that the information was restricted pending completion of mineral rights negotiations. Most intriguingly, Rosalind found a brief mention in a 1942 production report that referenced strategic mineral extraction from private properties in Thornfield County, with specific mention of the Blackwood Farm as a significant contributor to wartime mineral production needs. The report suggested that Magnus Blackwood's father had been quietly mining something valuable from the property during World War II, possibly under government contract. The puzzle pieces were beginning to form a coherent picture. Magnus Blackwood's family had known about the diamond deposits for generations, had possibly been extracting them quietly during the war, but had kept the secret to avoid attracting attention from large mining companies or government appropriation efforts. Rosalind began to understand why Emiko had been sworn to secrecy about the stones she'd found. If the Blackwood family had been conducting small-scale diamond mining operations, they would have needed to maintain absolute discretion to protect both their mineral rights and their competitive advantage. But something had gone wrong. Magnus Blackwood had died alone and apparently without heirs, taking the secret of the diamond deposits with him. The property had been abandoned for nearly 2 decades, its valuable deposits lying undiscovered, while the county tried unsuccessfully to sell the land for back taxes. That evening, Rosalind called the State University's geology department and spoke with Professor William Hendricks, who specialized in mineralogy and precious stone identification. She explained that she'd found some unusual stones on her property and would like to have them professionally evaluated.
"We do see interesting mineral specimens from your area occasionally," Professor Hendricks explained. "The geological conditions in Thornfield County are conducive to several types of valuable mineral formation. If you'd like to bring your samples to our lab, I'd be happy to examine them and provide identification." "What would be the cost for that kind of analysis?" Rosalind asked, already calculating whether she could afford professional geological consultation on her current budget. "For property owners in the region, we provide basic mineral identification services at no charge," the professor replied. "It's part of our community outreach program. More detailed analysis would carry fees, but initial identification is complimentary." Rosalind scheduled an appointment for the following Thursday, giving her several days to collect additional samples and prepare for what might be the most important evaluation of her life. Over the next 3 days, she made daily trips to the property with Keiko, systematically exploring the creek bed and surrounding hills for additional stone specimens. What they discovered exceeded even her most optimistic expectations. The unusual stones weren't limited to the creek bed near the lightning-struck oak. Following the watercourse upstream, they found the apparent source, an exposed vein of crystalline material in a hillside where erosion had worn away the topsoil. The vein extended into the hillside for an unknown distance, suggesting deposits that could be far more extensive than the scattered creekbed specimens they'd initially discovered. More significantly, the stones from the hillside source were larger and more clearly crystalline than those that had been tumbled by years of creek flow. Some specimens were nearly the size of chicken eggs, with the distinctive hardness and light-refracting qualities that Rosalind was beginning to recognize as potentially valuable. But their exploration had also revealed something troubling. On their third visit to the property, they'd discovered clear evidence that someone else had been examining the site recently. Footprints in the soft earth near the exposed vein, disturbed vegetation where someone had been digging. Most concerning, tire tracks from a large vehicle that had been driven onto the property using an access road that Rosalind hadn't previously noticed. "Mama, someone else has been here," Keiko observed, pointing to a cigarette butt that was clearly recent. "Do you think they know about our stones?" Rosalind examined the evidence of unauthorized visitors with growing unease. The footprints were from expensive boots, not the kind worn by casual trespassers or curious neighbors. The digging appeared systematic and informed, suggesting that whoever had been exploring our property possessed geological knowledge and was searching for something specific. Most troubling was the realization that their activities hadn't been unnoticed. If someone was conducting unauthorized exploration of their property, they likely knew about the potential value of what lay beneath the surface. That evening, Rosalind called Vernon Ashworth, their neighbor who owned the adjacent cattle ranch. She'd hoped he might have noticed unfamiliar vehicles or suspicious activity, but his response was evasive and concerning. "Can't say I've seen anything unusual," Ashworth replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "That Blackwood land has always attracted curious visitors, people looking for whatever it was Magnus was hiding up there. If I were you, I'd be careful about spending too much time alone on that property. Some stones are better left buried." The implied threat was subtle but unmistakable. Ashworth knew more about the Blackwood property than he'd admitted publicly, and he wasn't pleased about Rosalind's ownership or her exploration activities. After ending the call, Rosalind sat in their motel room reviewing her grandmother's diary, looking for additional clues about the property's history and the potential dangers that Emiko might have witnessed during her years of employment with the Blackwood family. One entry, dated September 3, 1943, was particularly ominous. "Men from the government came today to speak with Mr. Blackwood about the stones. They wore expensive suits and carried briefcases, but their eyes were cold like winter. After they left, Mr. Blackwood burned many papers in the backyard and told me that if anyone ever asked about what we produced here during the war, I should say I knew nothing. Some secrets," he said, "are dangerous enough to kill for." Another entry from 1947 provided additional context. "Magnus is becoming strange since his father died. He talks about continuing the family business, but doesn't trust anyone with the details. Yesterday I found him digging holes in the hillside near the creek, muttering about hiding the evidence. I think the war changed something in this family, and not for the better." Rosalind was beginning to understand that her grandmother's employment with the Blackwood family had provided her with knowledge of activities that went far beyond simple farming or even small-scale mining. The wartime production references, the government visitors, and Magnus Blackwood's subsequent paranoia suggested involvement in activities that might have had national security implications. If the Blackwood family had been mining diamonds for wartime industrial use, and if those operations had continued after the war, Magnus's isolation and secretiveness might have stemmed from legitimate concerns about government oversight or corporate acquisition attempts.
But Magnus had died without sharing his secrets, leaving the property abandoned and the diamond deposits undiscovered until Rosalind's desperate purchase had accidentally acquired mineral rights that might be worth millions. The phone in their motel room rang at exactly 11:30 p.m., an unusual time for calls, especially to their rarely used landline. When Rosalind answered, the voice was electronically disguised, but the message was crystal clear. "Miss Nakamura, some property purchases come with complications that extend beyond simple real estate transactions. The Blackwood land has a history that involves interests larger than your family's financial situation. Consider this friendly advice to avoid exploring certain areas of your property too thoroughly." Rosalind hung up without responding, but sleep became impossible. Someone had been monitoring her activities closely enough to know about her property exploration and had access to sophisticated communication equipment to deliver anonymous threats. The timing of the call, coming just before her scheduled appointment with the university geology professor, suggested that her potential discovery had attracted the attention of people with resources and connections that extended far beyond Thornfield County. As she lay awake listening to Keiko's labored breathing, Rosalind realized that her $400 gamble had potentially placed them in the middle of something far more complex and dangerous than a simple mineral discovery. Tomorrow's visit to Professor Hendricks would reveal whether her grandmother's stones were indeed valuable diamonds, but the anonymous threat suggested that the real challenge wouldn't be proving their worth, it would be surviving long enough to claim it. The stones sat in a canvas bag beside her bed, catching the occasional reflection from passing car headlights, holding secrets that had been buried for decades and might now be worth dying for. In 8 hours, she would finally learn whether her desperate purchase of worthless land had been the mistake everyone said it was, or the discovery that would change everything for her and Keiko, assuming they lived long enough to enjoy it. Serafina made her decision as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows. She would not be intimidated by mysterious watchers or bought off by shadowy church officials. Whatever lay beneath the sealed floor had been hidden for decades, and she intended to discover why. From her car, she retrieved the crowbar and hammer she always carried for emergency property assessments. As she returned to the sanctuary, she noticed the watchers had moved closer. The figure in clerical garb now stood openly in the cemetery, no longer bothering with concealment. Others had positioned themselves at the edge of the forest, creating a perimeter around the building. Her phone rang again. Archbishop Delacroix's cultured voice carried a new edge of urgency. "Miss Blackwood, our surveillance indicates you're preparing to proceed despite our generous offer. I implore you to reconsider. What you are about to uncover will put you at the center of a conflict that has raged for centuries." "What conflict?" Serafina wedged the crowbar along the sealed edge of the floor. "Go on." The sanctuary was built to hide something, not to worship something. The Thornfield Mining Company wasn't extracting silver from those mountains. They were extracting artifacts from a much older civilization. Pre-Columbian religious treasures worth more than most nations' GDP. The first section of sealant cracked under pressure. "Go on." In 1852, miners discovered a hidden chamber system in the mountains containing Aztec and Mayan religious artifacts that had been transported north centuries before the Spanish conquest. Gold religious masks, jade ceremonial knives, obsidian mirrors used by priests, and most importantly, the Codex Aureus, a golden book containing the complete religious and astronomical knowledge of 3 civilizations. It's considered the most valuable artifact in the Americas. Serafina paused her work. "And it's under this floor?" Along with approximately $300 million worth of other treasures. The mining company's European architects designed this sanctuary specifically to hide the artifacts, while maintaining the appearance of a normal religious building. But when word leaked about the discovery, various parties began competing for control. Another section of sealant gave way. The sealed area was definitely a removable panel, not solid floor. What parties? The Catholic Church claimed the artifacts should be repatriated to Vatican museums. The Mexican government demanded their return as stolen cultural patrimony. Several private collectors offered astronomical sums, and certain darker elements believed the artifacts contained actual mystical powers. Darker elements? Before Delacroix could answer, the sanctuary's main doors burst open. 3 figures entered, a woman in an expensive business suit, a man wearing a deputy sheriff's badge, and another man in clerical robes who wasn't Father Crowley. "Miss Blackwood," the woman called out, her heels clicking on the stone floor. "I'm Isabella Ravencroft, representing Ravencroft Acquisitions. We specialize in recovering lost cultural artifacts for legitimate museums and private collections." The deputy stepped forward. "Deputy Marshal Harrison Blackthorne, I have a warrant to search these premises for stolen cultural property." The cleric remained silent, but Serafina noticed his religious garments were wrong, too ornate, too theatrical. His cross was silver, inlaid with obsidian, and his eyes held no warmth whatsoever. "Convenient timing," Serafina said, not moving away from the sealed floor. 3 separate interested parties arriving just as I'm about to open this.
Isabella smiled coldly. "We've been monitoring this situation for months, waiting for someone to legally acquire the property. You see, we can't simply break in and steal artifacts. That would be grave robbing. But if the legal owner discovers them and chooses to sell," she pulled out a leather briefcase, "I'm authorized to offer $2 million cash for whatever you find down there." Deputy Blackthorne adjusted his gun belt. Course, if those artifacts were stolen from their rightful owners, they'd need to be confiscated as evidence. The false priest finally spoke, his accent unplaceable. "Some treasures carry curses, Miss Blackwood. Perhaps it would be wiser to leave them undisturbed." Serafina realized she was looking at representatives of the three factions Delacroix had mentioned: private collectors, law enforcement, and those who believed in the artifact's mystical properties. "Interesting," she said. "Three different approaches to the same goal. But you all have one problem." "What's that?" Isabella asked. "I legally own this property and everything on it, which means I'm going to open this floor and see what decades of secrecy have been protecting." With a final crack, the sealant gave way completely. The sealed section was indeed a removable panel, hinged on one side and secured with the metal clasps she'd noticed earlier. As she lifted it, a cool draft emerged from below, carrying the scent of cedar and something else, something that made her think of ancient temples and forgotten rituals. A ladder descended into darkness. She used her phone's flashlight to illuminate a chamber approximately 20 feet square, with stone walls that predated the sanctuary above by centuries. This wasn't a basement. It was a vault carved directly into the mountain bedrock. "Dear God," Isabella breathed, looking over Serafina's shoulder. The chamber contained wooden crates, stone pedestals, and display cases that would have done credit to any world-class museum. But it was the contents that made everyone freeze in amazement. Golden masks with jade inlay stared up at them with hollow eyes. Ceremonial obsidian knives lay arranged in precise patterns around carved stone altars. Feathered serpent sculptures coiled around pillars covered in hieroglyphic inscriptions, and in the center of the chamber, on a pedestal of black volcanic glass, sat what could only be the Codex Aureus. The golden book was open, revealing pages of hammered gold inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift in the flashlight beam. Each page was a masterpiece of metallurgy and artistry, covered with astronomical calculations, religious ceremonies, and what appeared to be mathematical formulas centuries ahead of their time. "The complete knowledge of 3 civilizations," Deputy Blackthorne whispered. "Astronomical data that wouldn't be rediscovered by Europeans for 400 years. Medical knowledge that could revolutionize modern healthcare, and religious insights that could reshape our understanding of pre-Columbian spirituality." The false priest moved closer to the ladder, his eyes gleaming with something that had nothing to do with scholarly interest. "And power," he added quietly, "real power for those who know how to use it." Isabella was already calculating values. Conservative estimates, the gold content alone exceeds $50 million. The archaeological value, incalculable. Private collectors would pay $300 million without hesitation. This explains everything, Serafina realized. The mining company found this chamber and built the sanctuary to hide it. They probably intended to gradually remove items and sell them, but something went wrong. "Father Mackenzie," Deputy Blackthorne said grimly, "the last priest assigned to this sanctuary. He discovered the chamber in 1987 and tried to alert authorities. Found dead 3 days later, officially ruled a heart attack." "Murder," Isabella corrected. "My organization has been investigating this for years. Mackenzie was killed by parties unknown, and the sanctuary was immediately closed. Various groups have been fighting over access ever since." The false priest stepped closer to the ladder, his eyes gleaming with something that had nothing to do with scholarly interest.
"Some treasures carry curses," he said. "Some secrets are worth killing for. Others are worth dying for." Serafina noticed he was reaching inside his robes, his hand moving toward what looked suspiciously like a weapon. Before anyone could react, the sanctuary doors burst open again. This time, a group of armed men in tactical gear flooded in, followed by a figure that made everyone freeze. A genuine Catholic archbishop in full ceremonial dress, flanked by two men who looked like federal agents. "Nobody move," ordered one of the agents, displaying FBI credentials. "This is now a federal investigation." The real Archbishop Delacroix stepped forward, his elderly face grave. "Miss Blackwood, I apologize for the deception. We've been trying to handle this quietly, but recent developments have forced our hand." "Archbishop, surely the church doesn't claim ownership. The church claims responsibility. These artifacts were hidden here specifically to prevent their misuse. They were never meant to be sold, displayed, or studied by those who might exploit their power." The false priest suddenly lunged toward the ladder, but one of the FBI agents tackled him before he could descend. As they struggled, his fake religious garments tore away, revealing elaborate tattoos covering his arms, symbols that matched the ones visible on the golden codex below.
"Disciples of the Obsidian Mirror," Deputy Blackthorne said grimly. "Cultists who believe pre-Columbian artifacts can grant actual supernatural powers. They've been trying to access this chamber for decades." The FBI agent handcuffed the cultist. "We've been tracking this organization for years. They're responsible for artifact thefts from museums across 3 continents." Serafina found herself at the center of a standoff between federal agents, private collectors, local law enforcement, church officials, and cultists, all competing for control of treasures worth $300 million. "What happens now?" she asked. Agent Sarah Coleman, the lead FBI investigator, consulted her tablet. "Legally, you own the property and anything discovered on it. But these artifacts were likely removed from Mexico without proper permits, which makes them subject to international repatriation laws. However," Archbishop Delacroix added, "the Church has documentation proving these items were placed in our protection by indigenous leaders fleeing Spanish persecution. They were hidden here not to steal them, but to preserve them." Isabella pulled out her phone. "My clients are prepared to offer $5 million for immediate purchase before any legal complications arise." The cultist, now secured but not silenced, laughed darkly. "You can't sell power. You can't own it. It belongs to those who understand its true nature." 3 hours later, as federal agents photographed and cataloged every item in the chamber, Serafina sat in the sanctuary's front pew, trying to process what she'd uncovered. Agent Coleman approached with a thick folder. "Preliminary assessment confirms your discovery is worth approximately $300 million, possibly more. The Codex Aureus alone could be valued at $100 million. It's the most complete pre-Columbian text ever found." "But I can't keep it, can I?" "Actually, you can. The artifacts were legally hidden on private property by their rightful guardians. The Church has documentation proving they weren't stolen but preserved. The Mexican government has been notified and agrees the items are safer remaining in protective custody until a permanent museum can be established." Archbishop Delacroix sat beside her. "Miss Blackwood, the Church would like to propose a partnership. You retain legal ownership, but we help establish the Magdalene Cultural Preservation Foundation. The artifacts remain here in a proper museum facility, but under your direction." "What about the cultists?" "The disciples of the Obsidian Mirror have been dealt with. Their leader has been extradited to face charges in 3 countries. The others, well, they'll think twice before attempting another theft." Isabella Ravencroft approached,
her business suit now rumpled from the day's excitement. "My offer stands, Miss Blackwood. $5 million, immediate transfer. You'd be financially set for life." Serafina looked at the golden artifacts glowing in the artificial light FBI technicians had set up. She thought about Father Mackenzie, murdered for trying to do the right thing. She thought about the indigenous leaders who had risked everything to preserve their cultural heritage. She thought about the decades of secrecy and violence surrounding these treasures. "I appreciate the offer, Miss Ravencroft, but some things are worth more than money." She turned to Archbishop Delacroix. "I accept your partnership proposal, with one condition. The museum must be free to the public, and it must tell the complete story, including the murder of Father Mackenzie and the decades of corruption that kept these treasures hidden." "Agreed." Agent Coleman smiled. "There's one more thing, Miss Blackwood. The federal government offers a substantial reward for the recovery of stolen cultural artifacts. In this case, given the value and historical significance of your discovery—" She handed Serafina a check that made her eyes widen. $15 million. Your reward for doing the right thing. 6 months later, Serafina stood in the newly constructed Magdalen Museum of Pre-Columbian Heritage, watching schoolchildren marvel at golden masks and jade ceremonial objects. The museum had become one of the most visited cultural sites in New England, attracting scholars from around the world. The 60-cent purchase had indeed changed her life, but not in the way she'd expected. She'd kept her day job as a historic preservation consultant, using the reward money to establish scholarships for indigenous students studying archaeology and cultural preservation. The sanctuary itself had been restored to its original glory, its stained glass windows now illuminating both Christian and pre-Columbian religious art in a unique celebration of cultural preservation. The chamber below had been expanded into a proper museum space with climate control and security systems that would have impressed the Smithsonian. Father Mackenzie had been posthumously honored with a memorial in the museum entrance, recognizing his sacrifice in trying to preserve these treasures for future generations. The cultists' attempts to claim the artifacts had been thoroughly defeated in court, and their organization had been disbanded by international law enforcement cooperation. Isabella Ravencroft had eventually opened her own legitimate antiquities consulting firm, helping museums around the world repatriate stolen cultural artifacts to their countries of origin.
Archbishop Delacroix had become a close friend and advisor, helping Serafina navigate the complex world of cultural preservation and international artifact law. Most importantly, the treasures themselves were being studied by legitimate scholars, their secrets slowly being revealed through proper archaeological methods rather than exploitation or theft. Standing in the museum at sunset, watching the last visitors of the day admire the Codex Aureus through its protective display case, Serafina reflected on the chain of events that had started with a 60-cent bid at a government auction. She'd bought what she thought was simply an abandoned building. Instead, she'd purchased the key to preserving $300 million worth of irreplaceable cultural heritage and ensuring that future generations could learn from the wisdom of civilizations that had flourished centuries before European contact. The 60 cents had been the best investment she'd ever made, not because of the money it eventually brought, but because it had shown her the person she was capable of becoming when faced with the choice between personal gain and cultural responsibility. She was no longer just Serafina Blackwood, historic preservation consultant. She was Serafina Blackwood, guardian of one of the most important archaeological discoveries in American history, and protector of cultural treasures that would educate and inspire visitors for generations to come. And that was worth far more than any amount of gold could ever be. As she locked the museum doors and headed home, she paused to read the inscription carved in stone above the entrance. Some treasures are worth more than their weight in gold. They're worth their weight in truth. The inscription was signed, in memory of Father Mackenzie, who died protecting what belongs to all humanity. Monday morning arrived gray and cold,
with storm clouds gathering over the mountains that surrounded Thornfield County like a protective barrier, or a prison, depending on your perspective. Rosalind Nakamura stood at the window of their motel room, watching the parking lot for signs of the luxury sedan that had delivered Marcus Rothschild's ultimatum 3 days earlier. The deadline was noon, and she had made her decision. "Mama, you look scared," observed Keiko from the bed where she was organizing her school supplies with the methodical precision that had become her coping mechanism for the uncertainty that had dominated their lives. "Not scared, sweetheart, determined." Rosalind turned from the window and knelt beside her daughter. "Today, we're going to start fighting for what belongs to our family. It might get difficult, but we're going to see it through." At 10:30 a.m., Rosalind called the number on Marcus Rothschild's business card. Her secretary informed her that Mr. Rothschild was expecting her call and would speak with her immediately. "Miss Nakamura, I trust you've had sufficient time to consider our generous offer." "I have considered it very carefully, Mr. Rothschild, and I'm declining. The Blackwood property is not for sale at any price." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Rothschild spoke again, his tone had shifted from businesslike courtesy to something considerably colder. "That's unfortunate, Miss Nakamura. You should understand that our offer represented the simplest resolution to a situation that can become quite complex. Without our cooperation, you may find that owning valuable property creates challenges that extend far beyond your current experience." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Rothschild?" "I'm informing you about the realities of mineral rights development in regions where established interests have operated for generations. Local banks, regulatory agencies, and municipal services often prove unreliable when property owners attempt to pursue development projects without appropriate partnerships." The threat was delivered with practiced subtlety, but its meaning was unmistakable. Rothschild represented interests with sufficient power to manipulate local institutions in ways that could make Rosalind's life impossible. "I understand your position, Mr. Rothschild, and I hope you understand mine. This property belongs to my family, and we intend to keep it." After ending the call, Rosalind immediately contacted Dr. Patricia Chen at the North Carolina Geological Survey. The official property assessment had been scheduled for Wednesday, but Rothschild's reaction to her rejection suggested that 2 days might be too long to wait for federal documentation of their diamond discovery. "Dr. Chen, I need to move up our timeline if possible. The pressure from mining interests is escalating, and I'm concerned about what might happen if they have time to interfere with the assessment process." Dr. Chen's response was immediate and professional. "I can be there this afternoon with a full survey team. Miss Nakamura, based on what Professor Hendricks has shared with me, your property may contain one of the most significant diamond deposits discovered in North Carolina in the past century. It's crucial that we document everything before any interested parties attempt to complicate the situation."
The Geological Survey team arrived at 2 p.m. in 3 vehicles, loaded with sophisticated equipment that looked more appropriate for space exploration than mineral assessment. Dr. Patricia Chen turned out to be a woman in her 40s with the focused intensity of someone who had spent decades extracting truth from reluctant geology. Her team included a geophysicist, a mineralogist, and a surveyor who immediately began establishing reference points for detailed property mapping. "Miss Nakamura, we're going to conduct a comprehensive assessment that will document the extent and quality of the mineral deposits on your property," Dr. Chen explained as her team unloaded ground-penetrating radar equipment. "This will provide legal documentation of your discovery that can't be challenged or dismissed by interested parties." The initial survey work focused on the hillside exposure where Rosalind and Keiko had found the largest diamond specimens. The geophysicist used ground-penetrating radar to map subsurface geological structures, while the mineralogist collected samples from the exposed crystalline vein. "This is remarkable," Dr. Chen said after examining the initial samples under a portable microscope. "The crystal structure and purity levels are consistent with Type 2A diamonds of exceptional quality. A geological formation suggests this deposit could extend significantly deeper and wider than the surface exposure indicates." As the survey team worked, Rosalind noticed they were being observed. A black SUV with tinted windows had parked on the access road that bordered their property, its occupants using binoculars to monitor the assessment activities. When she pointed this out to Dr. Chen, the geologist's expression became concerned. "That's troubling. Official geological surveys are supposed to be conducted without interference from private interests. I'm going to contact federal authorities about unauthorized surveillance of a government assessment operation." Dr. Chen made a call to what she described as federal oversight, speaking in technical terminology that suggested coordination with agencies beyond the State Geological Survey. The conversation was brief but apparently effective. Within 20 minutes, a Park Service vehicle arrived and positioned itself between the survey team and the watching SUV. "Ms. Nakamura, I want you to understand that discoveries of this magnitude often attract attention from national mining consortiums with resources that extend into political and regulatory spheres. The federal government has a vested interest in ensuring that significant mineral discoveries are developed in accordance with environmental and economic regulations, rather than being acquired through intimidation or fraud." The ground-penetrating radar revealed geological structures that excited the entire survey team. The diamond-bearing vein extended at least 200 feet into the hillside and connected to additional mineral formations that had been hidden by surface vegetation and erosion. "Based on preliminary assessment," the geophysicist reported, "this appears to be part of a much larger geological formation that could contain diamond deposits throughout a significant portion of your property." By late afternoon, Dr. Chen had collected enough evidence to provide preliminary estimates that left Rosalind stunned. "Ms. Nakamura, based on the quality and extent of the deposits we've documented today, the mineral value of your property could exceed $50 million. Possibly significantly more depending on the results of deep core sampling." $50 million. The number was so large that Rosalind couldn't process its implications. The $500,000 offer that had seemed overwhelming 3 days earlier represented less than 1% of the actual mineral value of their property. "What happens now?" she asked. "We'll complete detailed analysis of today's samples and provide you with official documentation within 72 hours. That documentation will establish legal proof of your mineral discovery and provide protection against challenges to your ownership rights." As the survey team packed their equipment, Dr. Chen pulled Rosalind aside for a private conversation. "Ms. Nakamura, I need to be completely honest with you about the situation you're now facing. Diamond discoveries of this magnitude have historically attracted attention from organizations with virtually unlimited resources and few scruples about how they acquire mineral rights. The federal documentation will provide legal protection, but legal protection and physical safety are sometimes different things." "Are you saying we're in danger?" "I'm saying that $50 million in mineral rights represents enough money to justify significant risks for people who operate outside legal boundaries. I strongly recommend that you consider protective custody until the federal documentation is complete and your legal position is unassailable." That evening, Rosalind sat in their motel room with Keiko, trying to explain that their lives were about to change in ways that neither of them could fully anticipate. "Sweetheart, remember how I told you that sometimes doing the right thing can be difficult? Well, we're about to find out just how difficult it can be." "Are the bad people going to try to take our diamonds away?" Keiko asked with the directness that children bring to complex adult situations. "They're going to try, but we're not going to let them." The first indication of escalating pressure came at 8 p.m. when the manager of the Sunrise Motel informed Rosalind that they would need to vacate their room by the following morning. "I'm real sorry, Ms. Nakamura, but we've had some complaints about noise and disruption associated with your stay. Corporate policy requires us to ask guests who create problems for other customers to find alternative accommodations." The excuse was transparently false. They'd been model tenants for months, but the manager's nervous demeanor suggested he was acting under pressure from people he didn't want to disappoint. "Who complained about us?" Rosalind asked. "I can't share that information. It's confidential, but you'll need to be out by 10 a.m. tomorrow." Finding alternative accommodations in Thornfield County proved impossible. Every motel, boarding house, and rental property was suddenly fully booked or not accepting new tenants. The coordinated nature of the housing blacklist was too systematic to be coincidental. By 10 p.m., Rosalind realized they were facing a deliberate campaign to make it impossible for them to remain in the county while the federal documentation process was completed. Without local housing, they would be forced to leave the area, making it difficult to protect their property and mineral rights. The solution came from an unexpected source. Professor William Hendricks called at 10:30 p.m. with an offer of assistance. "Miss Nakamura, Dr. Chen has briefed me on the survey results and the pressure you're facing. I have a cabin about 20 miles from your property that I use for a geological fieldwork. It's isolated, defensible, and off the main road network. You and Keiko are welcome to stay there until the federal documentation is completed." The offer was both generous and necessary. Professor Hendricks' cabin would provide secure housing while keeping them close enough to monitor and protect their property. The move to the cabin required careful planning to avoid surveillance. At 3 a.m., Rosalind loaded their belongings into her Toyota while Keiko slept in the passenger seat, then drove through back roads that wound through the mountains surrounding Thornfield County. The cabin was indeed isolated, a small but comfortable structure nestled in a valley that was invisible from any public roads. "It's not luxurious, but it's secure and private," Professor Hendricks explained as he showed them around the cabin. "There's a landline phone that connects directly to university security, and the nearest neighbor is 5 miles away. Most importantly, the property records show this cabin as belonging to the university's geology department, so it won't be easy for interested parties to locate you here." Tuesday morning brought the first direct confrontation since Rosalind's rejection of Rothschild's offer. She was driving to town for groceries when 2 vehicles blocked the mountain road she was traveling, forcing her to stop. 4 men emerged from the vehicles, not the sophisticated businessmen who had made the initial purchase offer, but individuals who looked more comfortable with physical intimidation than financial negotiation. "Miss Nakamura," the apparent leader said, approaching her car, "you've been making some poor decisions lately, rejecting generous offers, involving government agencies and private business matters, generally making life complicated for people who prefer simplicity." Rosalind kept her hands on the steering wheel and tried to project calm she didn't feel. "I'm just trying to protect my property rights." "Your property rights are about to become significantly more complicated. You see, there are legal challenges being filed today that question your ownership of the Blackwood property. Seems there may have been irregularities in the tax sale that transferred the land to you." The threat was specific and credible. Legal challenges to property ownership could tie up mineral rights for years while court cases proceeded, during which time interested parties could work to acquire the property through alternative means. "There are also questions being raised about your immigration status. ICE has received reports about undocumented individuals working in the county. Could be a long investigation, might require detention while documentation is verified." The immigration threat was particularly insidious. Even though Rosalind was a legal citizen, ICE investigations could result in detention and family separation that would make it impossible to protect their mineral rights. However, the man's tone shifted to false reasonableness. These complications could be avoided if you reconsidered your position on selling the property. New offer is $300,000. Closing within 24 hours, all legal problems disappear. The reduced offer demonstrated their increasing desperation to acquire the mineral rights quickly, but also their confidence that legal and bureaucratic harassment would eventually force capitulation. "I need to think about it," Rosalind replied, playing for time while she considered options. "You have until tomorrow morning. After that, the legal challenges proceed, and we can't guarantee that future offers will be as generous."
After the intimidators departed, Rosalind drove directly to the Thornfield County Sheriff's Department to report the threats and roadblock. But Deputy Marcus Webb's response was even more dismissive than his previous indifference. "Miss Nakamura, what you're describing sounds like a business negotiation that got a little heated. Unless you have evidence of specific crimes, there's not much we can investigate." "They blocked a public road and threatened me with false immigration charges." "According to our records, there was road construction on that route this morning. Could have been legitimate traffic control. As for immigration issues, that's federal jurisdiction. We don't get involved in those matters." The deputy's response confirmed that local law enforcement was either compromised or deliberately unhelpful.
That afternoon, she received a call from Dr. Patricia Chen with mixed news. The detailed analysis of their diamond samples had confirmed the preliminary assessment. The mineral value of their property was indeed in excess of $50 million. But federal documentation was being delayed by administrative complications that could postpone official recognition of their mineral rights. "Ms. Nakamura, I want to be completely honest about what we're facing. Someone with significant influence is using bureaucratic procedures to slow down the federal documentation process. Without that documentation, your legal position remains vulnerable to challenges." "How long could the delays last?" "Potentially months, if they're able to keep creating procedural obstacles. In the meantime, you'll be operating without federal protection for your mineral rights." The strategic situation was becoming clear. The mining interests were using legal challenges and bureaucratic delays to create a window of vulnerability during which they could acquire the mineral rights through fraud, intimidation, or administrative manipulation. But Dr. Chen had additional information that provided a potential solution. "However, there is another approach we can pursue. The Department of Interior has emergency procedures for protecting significant mineral discoveries that face immediate threats from private interests. If you're willing to document the intimidation and harassment you've received, we can request expedited federal protection under the national security provisions." The national security angle was complex but potentially powerful. Diamond deposits had strategic importance for industrial applications, and foreign acquisition of significant mineral resources could trigger federal oversight that superseded local legal challenges. "What would that involve?" Rosalind asked. "Federal marshals, witness protection protocols, and expedited legal processing that bypasses state and local administrative procedures. But it also means your situation becomes a federal case with national visibility." That evening, Rosalind sat in Professor Hendrick's cabin with Keiko, reviewing the documentation she'd collected about the threats and harassment they'd faced. The evidence was substantial. Anonymous phone calls, coordinated housing discrimination, official harassment, roadblocks, and explicit threats about false legal challenges. "Mama, are we going to have to hide from the bad people for a long time?" Keiko asked, looking up from a geology book Professor Hendricks had left for her. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I know we're going to keep fighting for what Grandma Emiko wanted us to have. She would be proud of us, wouldn't she?" "Yes, I think she would be very proud." The decision to request federal protection crystallized during the night, triggered by an incident that demonstrated the escalating danger of their situation. At 2 a.m., Rosalind was awakened by the sound of vehicles approaching the cabin. Through the windows, she could see headlights from multiple cars surrounding the property. Men with flashlights were conducting what appeared to be a systematic search of the grounds. They knew she and Keiko were inside. Several times, flashlight beams illuminated the windows where Rosalind was watching, but they made no attempt to force entry. The message was clear. "We know where you are. We can reach you whenever we choose, and next time we might not be so restrained." After the intruders departed, Rosalind spent the remaining hours until dawn planning their next move. The escalating harassment and direct threats had crossed the line from business pressure into criminal intimidation that endangered her daughter's safety. Wednesday morning, she called Dr. Patricia Chen and formally requested federal protection under the Department of Interior's emergency procedures for threatened mineral discoveries. "Dr. Chen, I have documented evidence of systematic intimidation, threats, and last night they surrounded our location with armed personnel. My daughter and I need federal protection, and I need expedited processing of our mineral rights documentation."
I'll initiate the emergency protocols immediately. Can you be at the Asheville Federal Building by 2 p.m. today? Yes. Bring all documentation of the threats and harassment. Federal marshals will meet you there and begin protection protocols while we process your case. As Rosalind packed their belongings for another relocation, this time to federal protection, she reflected on how dramatically their lives had changed since her grandmother's inheritance had allowed them to purchase the worthless Blackwood property. 3 weeks ago, they had been struggling to pay for a motel room. Today, they were entering federal witness protection because their mineral rights were valuable enough to justify systematic criminal intimidation by organized interests with resources that extended throughout local government and law enforcement. The $400 purchase that everyone had ridiculed as financial stupidity had revealed mineral deposits worth $50 million. But claiming that wealth required surviving a battle against opponents that had demonstrated willingness to use illegal methods to acquire valuable property. As they prepared to leave Professor Hendrick's cabin for the uncertain protection of federal custody, Keiko asked the question that captured the complexity of their situation. "Mama, if we're rich now, why do we have to keep running away?"
Because, sweetheart, sometimes being rich makes you a target for people who are willing to do terrible things for money. But we're going to make sure they don't succeed. The battle for their diamond discovery was escalating beyond legal and financial pressure into territory that threatened their safety and freedom. But federal protection would provide resources and authority to confront opponents who had operated with impunity in local jurisdictions. The fight for the Blackwood diamonds was about to become a federal case, with all the power and publicity that such designation would bring. Don't miss Part 4, where Rosalind and Keiko enter federal protection and discover that their diamond discovery has attracted attention from mining interests with connections that reach into the highest levels of government, forcing them to navigate a complex web of political influence, corporate corruption, and family loyalty as they fight to claim the generational wealth that their grandmother had preserved for nearly a century. The Asheville Federal Building stood like a fortress of glass and steel against the afternoon sky, its imposing facade designed to project the authority and permanence of federal power. Rosalind Nakamura clutched Keiko's hand as they approached the security checkpoint, both carrying small suitcases that contained everything they owned after 3 weeks of running from forces that seemed to control every aspect of local life in Thornfield County. U.S. Marshal Jennifer Torres met them at the security desk, her professional demeanor immediately putting Rosalind at ease. Marshal Torres was a woman in her early 40s with the alert eyes of someone trained to assess threats and the calm confidence that came from years of protecting people in dangerous situations. "Miss Nakamura, I'm Marshal Torres. Dr. Chen from the Geological Survey has briefed me on your situation, and we're taking it very seriously. You and Keiko will be under federal protection while we investigate the threats you've documented and expedite the processing of your mineral rights claim." As they rode the elevator to the 16th floor, Marshal Torres explained the protection protocols they would be entering. "You'll be housed at a secure federal facility outside the city while our investigation proceeds. The location isn't disclosed even to local law enforcement, and access is restricted to personnel with federal security clearances. Your safety is our primary concern, but we also need your cooperation in building cases against the individuals and organizations that have been intimidating you." The federal prosecutor's office occupied half of the 16th floor, with conference rooms equipped for secure communications and walls lined with law enforcement awards and photographs of successful prosecutions. Assistant U.S. Attorney David Morrison, a tall man with prematurely gray hair and the intense focus of someone who had spent years prosecuting complex financial crimes, was waiting to interview them. "Ms. Nakamura, based on preliminary review of your documentation, we believe you've been targeted by an organized criminal enterprise that specializes in acquiring valuable mineral rights through intimidation, fraud, and corruption of local officials," Morrison explained as they settled around a conference table. "This isn't just about your property. It's part of a pattern that may extend across multiple states and involve federal crimes." The scope of the investigation surprised Rosalind. She had thought they were facing local corruption and business pressure, not organized criminal activity that had attracted federal attention.
How many other people have faced similar situations? She asked. Based on preliminary investigation, at least 12 property owners in North Carolina, Virginia, and Tennessee have reported similar patterns of intimidation after discovering valuable mineral deposits. In most cases, the pressure was successful. The property owners eventually sold their mineral rights for fractions of their actual value. Morrison opened a file folder containing photographs and documents. What makes your case different is the quality of documentation you've provided and your willingness to resist the pressure campaign. Most victims were isolated and had no resources to fight back effectively. Over the next 3 hours, Rosalind provided detailed testimony about every aspect of the intimidation campaign, from the initial anonymous phone calls through the armed surveillance at Professor Hendricks's cabin. Morrison's questions were thorough and precise, designed to build admissible evidence for federal prosecutions. Ms. Nakamura, I want to be completely transparent about what you're facing. The organization targeting you has connections that extend into state government, federal regulatory agencies, and major mining corporations. Dismantling their operation will require prosecutions at multiple levels and may take years to complete. What does that mean for us? It means you'll be in federal protection for an extended period while we build cases and conduct trials. It also means that when this investigation becomes public, you'll face media attention and political pressure that could be overwhelming. That evening, Marshal Torres transported Rosalind and Keiko to their new home, a secure federal facility that had been converted from a decommissioned military installation in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The facility was surrounded by multiple layers of security and staffed by federal marshals who specialized in protecting witnesses in high-stakes criminal cases.
This is temporary housing while we establish more permanent arrangements, Marshal Torres explained as she showed them to a comfortable apartment within the secure compound. You have access to medical care, educational resources for Keiko, and communication systems that can't be monitored or intercepted by outside parties. The facility felt like a combination of summer camp and minimum security prison, comfortable but isolated, safe but constrained. Other residents included families who had been targeted by organized crime, corporate executives who had exposed financial fraud, and government employees who had revealed corruption in federal agencies. "Mama, is this like being in jail?" Keiko asked as they unpacked their few belongings in the apartment that would be their home for an indefinite period. "No, sweetheart. It's like being in a safe place while other people fight the bad guys for us." Over the following days, Rosalind learned more about the criminal organization that had targeted them. Federal investigators had been tracking what they called the Appalachian Mining Consortium, a network of corporations, lawyers, and corrupt officials who specialize in acquiring valuable mineral rights through systematic intimidation and legal manipulation. The consortium's methods were sophisticated and well-funded. They maintained intelligence networks that identified promising mineral discoveries, legal teams that challenged property ownership through technical disputes, and enforcement personnel who provided physical intimidation when financial pressure proved insufficient. Their business model depends on operating faster than federal oversight can respond, Special Agent Sarah Kim from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division explained during a briefing. They identify valuable mineral deposits, acquire the rights through questionable means, then extract maximum value before legal challenges can be resolved. Agent Kim provided documentation of 12 similar cases where property owners had faced identical pressure tactics. The pattern was consistent: anonymous threats, housing discrimination, official harassment, escalating intimidation, then buyout offers at fractions of actual mineral value. In most cases, the pressure campaign succeeded within 60 to 90 days. Property owners typically sold their mineral rights rather than face ongoing legal and financial harassment. But Rosalind's case had disrupted their typical timeline. The geological survey documentation and federal protection had prevented quick acquisition of the mineral rights, forcing the consortium to operate in an environment where their activities were being monitored and documented by federal investigators. Your resistance to their pressure campaign has provided us with evidence we never had before, Agent Kim explained during a secure briefing. Previous victims typically capitulated before we could gather admissible proof of criminal activity.
The federal investigation revealed connections that extended far beyond local corruption in Thornfield County. The Appalachian Mining Consortium included executives from 3 major mining corporations, federal regulatory officials who expedited permits for consortium projects, and state legislators who modified mineral rights laws to benefit their operations. Most shocking was the discovery that Senator Robert Ashworth, Vernon Ashworth's brother, had been receiving significant campaign contributions from consortium-affiliated corporations while sponsoring legislation that weakened environmental oversight of mining operations. We're looking at systematic corruption that reaches into the U.S. Senate, Morrison explained during a secure video conference. Your mineral rights case has uncovered a criminal network that's been operating for over a decade. 2 weeks into federal protection, Dr. Patricia Chin provided the official geological assessment that had been delayed by bureaucratic interference. The final documentation exceeded even the preliminary estimates that had prompted their entry into protection. Ms. Nakamura, the comprehensive survey has confirmed mineral deposits valued at approximately $87 million, Dr. Chin announced during a secure call. The diamond formations extend throughout your property and include several pockets of exceptionally rare Type 2B diamonds that are particularly valuable to industrial applications. $87 million. The figure was so large that Rosalind still couldn't fully comprehend its implications. The $400 investment that had triggered mockery and ridicule had acquired mineral rights worth more than the annual budgets of most small cities. But the increased valuation also intensified the pressure from criminal interests who stood to lose enormous profits if federal prosecution succeeded in protecting her mineral rights. The consortium is escalating their efforts to acquire your property, Agent Kim warned during a security briefing. Intelligence suggests they're planning legal challenges that could tie up your mineral rights for years while they attempt to acquire the property through alternative means. The legal challenges materialized within days. A corporation called Piedmont Heritage Holdings filed suit claiming that the Blackwood property had been illegally transferred during the tax sale, citing technical violations of notification requirements. Simultaneously, the Environmental Protection Agency received complaints alleging that mineral extraction on the property would violate federal watershed protection regulations.
These challenges are designed to create legal uncertainty while they work to acquire your property through fraudulent means, Morrison explained. But federal courts have jurisdiction over mineral rights cases involving properties under government protection, so their forum shopping strategies won't be effective. The consortium's desperation became apparent when they attempted to bribe federal officials involved in the protection operation. Agent Kim shared transcripts of recorded conversations where consortium representatives offered substantial payments to federal prosecutors and marshals in exchange for information about protection protocols and legal strategies. They've offered Marshal Torres $2 million for information about your location, Kim revealed. They offered me $5 million to provide advance notice of federal indictments. When federal officials can't be bought, it usually means the criminal organization is facing existential threats to their operations. But the most disturbing development came when federal investigators discovered that consortium operatives had been conducting surveillance of the secure facility where Rosalind and Keiko were housed. They've been monitoring this facility for the past week using sophisticated electronic surveillance, Marshal Torres announced during an emergency security briefing. We're implementing enhanced protection protocols and preparing to relocate you to an even more secure location. The new facility was a classified location that officially didn't exist, operated by federal agencies whose names couldn't be disclosed for national security reasons. The level of security suggested that Rosalind and Keiko's case had implications that extended beyond criminal prosecution into areas of strategic national interest. "Are we in danger from foreign governments?" Rosalind asked during a classified briefing that took place in a room with no windows and communication equipment she didn't recognize.
The primary threat remains domestic criminal organizations, but foreign acquisition of strategic mineral resources is monitored and sometimes prevented through methods that aren't disclosed to civilian populations. As winter settled over the mountains surrounding their classified protection facility, Rosalind reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with her grandmother's inheritance and a desperate decision to purchase worthless land at a county tax sale. Keiko had adapted to their situation with the resilience of childhood, making friends among the children of other protected witnesses and excelling in the advanced educational programs provided by federal tutors. But she also understood that their lives had changed permanently. "Mama, when this is all over, will we be able to go home?" she asked one evening as they sat by the window of their secure apartment, watching snowfall on the classified mountains that surrounded their sanctuary. "We'll make a new home, sweetheart. Somewhere safe where we can use Grandma Emiko's gift to build the kind of future she wanted for our family. Will we be rich? We'll be secure. We'll never have to worry about having enough money for rent or medicine or food. You'll be able to go to any college you want and become anything you choose to be." The federal investigation had expanded to include 47 defendants across 6 states, with charges ranging from organized racketeering to corruption of federal officials. The Appalachian Mining Consortium's operations had been systematically dismantled, with assets frozen and leadership facing decades in federal prison. But the legal proceedings would take years to complete, during which Rosalind and Keiko would remain in federal protection. The mineral rights that could transform their lives remained tied up in litigation while prosecutors built cases that would prevent similar criminal enterprises from operating in the future. The good news, Morrison explained during their monthly legal briefing, is that federal courts have upheld your property ownership and mineral rights. The consortium's legal challenges have been dismissed, and you have clear title to $87 million in diamond deposits. The challenging news is that actual mineral extraction will require environmental assessments, federal permits, and partnership with legitimate mining corporations, processes that could take 2 to 3 years to complete, even under optimal circumstances. Meanwhile, media attention had transformed their story into a national phenomenon. The case of a struggling single mother whose $400 land purchase had uncovered an $87 million diamond deposit while exposing systematic criminal corruption captured public imagination and political attention.
60 Minutes wants to interview you, Marshal Torres mentioned during a security update. Congress is planning hearings about criminal manipulation of mineral rights. The president's economic advisors are using your case as an example of small business success threatened by organized crime. But media attention also brought unwanted scrutiny and pressure. Distant relatives emerged claiming portions of Grandmother Emiko's estate. Investment advisors offered wealth management services. Politicians sought photo opportunities that would associate them with her success story. Calibration can be more dangerous than anonymity, Agent Thompson warned. Public attention makes protection more complicated and provides criminal organizations with additional leverage for pressure campaigns. As spring arrived at their classified facility, bringing the first anniversary of her impulsive decision to purchase the Blackwood property, Rosalind received news that would determine her family's future. The Department of Justice had reached a plea agreement with the Appalachian Mining Consortium's leadership. In exchange for testimony about criminal operations and cooperation with asset forfeiture proceedings, the consortium would pay $47 million in restitution to property owners who had been defrauded over the previous decade. But more importantly for Rosalind's immediate situation, the plea agreement included provisions that would expedite federal permitting for legitimate mining extraction from the Blackwood property. We've identified 3 mining corporations with impeccable environmental and safety records who are interested in partnership arrangements for extracting the diamond deposits, Morrison announced during a video conference.
These partnerships would provide you with ongoing royalty income while ensuring that extraction proceeds according to federal environmental and safety standards. The partnership arrangements offered Rosalind choices she had never imagined having. Conservative approaches that would generate steady income over decades, aggressive extraction that would maximize immediate returns, environmental conservation that would preserve portions of the property while allowing limited mining operations. "What would you recommend?" she asked Morrison during a private consultation. "Honestly, take the conservative approach that ensures long-term income security. $87 million in mineral deposits can generate substantial annual royalties for the rest of your life and provide generational wealth for Keiko's future." That evening, Rosalind called her sister Margot in Baton Rouge to share news that their family's financial struggles were finally ending. "Rosalind, I can't believe what you've accomplished," Margot said, her voice filled with amazement and pride. "Everyone thought you were crazy for buying that worthless land, but you've created generational wealth for our family." "It wasn't wisdom, Margot. It was desperation and Grandma Emiko's stories. But I think she would be proud that we didn't give up when things got dangerous. She would be amazed that her firestones turned out to be worth nearly $100 million. As Rosalind prepared for sleep in their secure federal facility, surrounded by the protection of the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the world, she reflected on the extraordinary sequence of events that had transformed their lives. The $400 purchase that had been mocked as the stupidest financial decision in Thornfield County history had revealed mineral deposits worth more than most lottery jackpots. But claiming that wealth had required courage to resist criminal intimidation, trust in federal institutions, and patience to survive legal proceedings that had consumed more than a year of their lives. Most importantly, it had required faith in her grandmother's wisdom in stories, faith that had been vindicated by the discovery of diamond deposits that Emiko had protected through decades of silence and secrecy. Tomorrow would bring decisions about mining partnerships and wealth management that would determine how their newfound fortune would be developed and preserved. But tonight, for the first time since purchasing the Blackwood property, Rosalind fell asleep without fear about their future. The woman who had been called stupid for buying worthless land was about to become one of the wealthiest individuals in North Carolina, protected by federal law and supported by institutions that would ensure her family's security for generations to come. The battle for the Blackwood diamonds was nearly over, and against all odds, the struggling single mother and her 10-year-old daughter had won. Don't miss Part 5, where Rosalind negotiates mining partnerships that will transform the Blackwood property into one of America's most productive diamond mines in North America, while planning her family's return to normal life as millionaires whose success has inspired congressional hearings about protecting small property owners from organized criminal enterprises. 18 months after entering federal protection, Rosalind Nakamura stood in the executive conference room of the Department of Interior, wearing a navy blue suit that had been purchased for her by the Federal Witness Protection Program. Around the polished mahogany table sat representatives from 3 of America's most respected mining corporations, each presenting proposals for partnerships that would transform the Blackwood property into one of the most productive diamond mines in North America.
Keiko, now 12 years old and displaying the poise that came from spending formative months among federal officials and protection specialists, sat quietly beside her mother, taking notes in a composition book with the methodical precision she'd inherited from her great-grandmother Emiko. The girl who had once collected pretty stones from a creek bed now understood that those stones represented a fortune that would affect not just their family, but the economic development of an entire region. "Miss Nakamura," began Charles Whitfield, CEO of Apex Mining Consortium, "our proposal involves a 40-year partnership that would guarantee you 18% royalties on all mineral extraction, plus a signing bonus of $12 million and ongoing annual minimum payments of $2 million, regardless of production levels." The figures that had once seemed impossibly large now represented just one of several options for monetizing the diamond deposits that federal geological surveys had confirmed were among the richest ever discovered in North America.
The conservative estimate of $87 million in mineral value had been revised upward to $127 million as additional surveys revealed deeper and more extensive crystalline formations. Assistant U.S. Attorney David Morrison, who had spent the past year prosecuting the criminal conspiracy that had targeted Rosalind's property rights, sat at the head of the table reviewing the legal documents that would formalize whichever partnership she selected. Each of these proposals has been thoroughly reviewed by federal regulators, Morrison explained. Environmental impact assessments have been completed, and all three companies have impeccable safety and conservation records. Your choice should be based on which arrangement best serves your family's long-term interests. The second proposal came from Heritage Geological Development, represented by CEO Maria Santos, whose company specialized in environmentally sustainable mining operations that preserved significant portions of properties for conservation and recreation. Our approach would involve extracting diamonds from approximately 60% of your property while preserving the remaining 40% as a nature conservancy. This would generate somewhat lower annual returns, approximately 14% royalties, but would ensure that the Blackwood property remains a natural heritage site for future generations. The conservative approach appealed to Rosalind's desire to honor her grandmother's connection to the land, but the financial returns would be substantially lower than the other proposals. The difference between 14 and 18% royalties represented millions of dollars annually that could fund education, healthcare, and charitable activities. The third proposal, from Continental Resources Mining, offered the most aggressive extraction timeline and highest immediate returns, but involved environmental modifications that would permanently alter the character of the property. We could complete extraction within 12 years while guaranteeing you 22% royalties and a $25 million signing bonus, explained CEO Robert Chan. This approach would maximize your immediate returns and allow you to diversify investments while you're still young enough to actively manage your wealth. Dr. Patricia Chan, from the North Carolina Geological Survey, who had provided the technical documentation that protected Rosalind's mineral rights, offered technical perspective on the proposals. From a geological standpoint, all three approaches are technically feasible and environmentally responsible. The question is whether you prefer steady long-term income, moderate returns with conservation benefits, or maximum immediate extraction with higher environmental impact. Marshal Jennifer Torres, who had become almost a family friend during their months in federal protection, provided security perspective on the proposals. From a protection standpoint, all three companies have been thoroughly investigated and cleared of connections to the criminal organizations that previously targeted you. Whichever partnership you select will provide security resources that will ensure your ongoing safety and privacy. But the most important perspective came from an unexpected source. Michael Whittemore, son of the insurance adjuster whose evidence had inspired the original story structure, had been following Rosalind's case through media coverage and had requested permission to share his father's experience with long-term document preservation and wealth management. Ms. Nakamura, my father spent decades documenting evidence because he understood that some discoveries are too important to be handled carelessly. Your mineral discovery represents generational wealth that could benefit not just your family, but your entire community if managed wisely. Whittemore's advice resonated with Rosalind's desire to honor her grandmother's legacy while ensuring that their newfound wealth would benefit others who had faced similar struggles. "What would you recommend?" she asked. Consider the Heritage Geological proposal with conservation components, but negotiate for higher royalty percentages and community development provisions. Your success story could inspire programs that help other families discover and develop natural resources on their properties. The negotiation process took 3 weeks, during which Rosalind's federal-appointed legal advisors worked with Heritage Geological to craft an arrangement that balanced her family's financial interests with broader community development goals.
The final agreement provided 16% royalties on mineral extraction, a $15 million signing bonus, conservation of 35% of the property for environmental preservation, and establishment of a community development fund that would provide low-interest loans for other families seeking to purchase and develop undervalued properties.
This arrangement will generate annual income of approximately $4 to $6 million for the next 30 years, Morrison explained during the contract signing ceremony. It also establishes the Nakamura Community Development Foundation with an initial endowment of $5 million to help other families achieve property ownership and resource development. The signing ceremony was held at the restored Blackwood farmhouse, which Heritage Geological had renovated as part of their conservation commitment. The building that had stood empty and deteriorating for nearly 2 decades now served as headquarters for mining operations and the community foundation. Media coverage of the signing was extensive, with news outlets describing Rosalind's journey from struggling single mother to multimillionaire as an example of American opportunity and the importance of protecting individual property rights from organized criminal interference. This case demonstrates that federal institutions can effectively protect individual citizens from criminal organizations with significant resources and political connections, explained FBI Director Sarah Williams during a press conference announcing the conclusion of the investigation. The Appalachian Mining Consortium has been dismantled, its leadership imprisoned, and its corrupt practices exposed and prevented. The criminal prosecutions had indeed been comprehensive. 47 defendants across 6 states had been convicted of charges ranging from organized racketeering to corruption of federal officials. Total sentences exceeded 800 years in federal prison, with asset forfeitures generating more than $200 million for victim compensation and law enforcement operations. Senator Robert Ashworth, whose corruption had been exposed during the investigation, had resigned from office and received a 15-year federal prison sentence for accepting bribes and manipulating legislation to benefit criminal mining operations. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the passage of federal legislation that strengthened protection for small property owners who discovered valuable mineral resources. The Nakamura Protection Act established federal oversight procedures, expedited federal protection for threatened property owners, and created criminal penalties for organized attempts to acquire mineral rights through intimidation or fraud. Your courage to resist criminal pressure has created legal protections that will benefit property owners throughout America, Congressman David Martinez explained during congressional hearings on the legislation. The Nakamura case demonstrates that individual determination, combined with effective federal institutions, can overcome organized criminal activity. As autumn settled over Thornfield County, bringing the 2nd anniversary of her impulsive decision to purchase the Blackwood property, Rosalind stood on the restored front porch of the farmhouse that was now the operational headquarters of one of America's most productive diamond mines. The transformation was remarkable. The property that had been dismissed as worthless now employed 127 people in high-paying mining and environmental conservation jobs. The Community Development Foundation had provided loans for 18 families to purchase and develop properties in the region. The annual economic impact exceeded $40 million for Thornfield County alone. But the most meaningful transformation was personal. Keiko, now attending private school while living in the restored farmhouse, had developed into a confident and thoughtful young woman who understood both the privileges and responsibilities that came with sudden wealth. "Mama, do you think Grandma Emiko knew what would happen when she told you those stories about the firestones?" Keiko asked as they watched Heritage Geological's mining operations extract diamonds from the hillside, where they had first discovered the unusual crystalline formations. "I think she knew that someday someone in our family would be brave enough to follow her instructions and patient enough to fight for what was right. She preserved the secret for 90 years, waiting for the right person at the right time to unlock what she had discovered." The diamonds extracted from the Blackwood property had indeed proven to be among the finest ever discovered in North America. Type 2A diamonds with exceptional clarity and purity, valued not just for jewelry applications, but for advanced industrial and technological uses that commanded premium prices from international buyers. Annual royalty payments to Rosalind now exceeded $5 million, generating wealth that would ensure security for multiple generations of her family while funding charitable activities throughout the region. The Nakamura Community Development Foundation had expanded beyond mineral development to include educational scholarships, small business loans, and healthcare initiatives for families throughout Appalachian communities that had historically been exploited by extractive industries. We're proving that natural resource development can benefit local communities rather than just external corporations, explained Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the Foundation's executive director, during the annual board meeting. The Nakamura model demonstrates that individual property ownership, combined with responsible development partnerships, can create sustainable prosperity for entire regions.
But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the vindication of Rosalind's decision to resist the criminal pressure that had nearly forced her to abandon her mineral rights. Vernon Ashworth, the neighbor who had publicly ridiculed her property purchase, had been convicted of conspiracy charges for his role in the intimidation campaign. His cattle ranch had been seized under federal asset forfeiture laws, with the property eventually purchased by the Community Development Foundation and converted into a cooperative farming operation that provided opportunities for families seeking agricultural careers. Marcus Rothschild, who had delivered the initial $500,000 buyout offer, had received a 25-year federal prison sentence for his leadership role in the criminal mining consortium. His organization's assets had been liquidated to compensate victims of their fraud and intimidation campaigns. The officials who had participated in the harassment campaign, deputies, regulators, and municipal employees who had used their positions to pressure Rosalind to abandon her property rights, had faced criminal charges, job termination, and civil liability that would affect their finances for decades. Justice isn't just about punishment, Morrison explained during the final legal briefing. It's about ensuring that criminal behavior doesn't succeed and that victims are fully compensated for the harm they endured. As winter approached, bringing the holiday season that would mark their third Christmas since the diamond discovery, Rosalind reflected on the extraordinary journey that had transformed their lives and created opportunities she had never imagined possible. The $400 investment that had been mocked as financial stupidity had generated wealth that placed her among the richest individuals in North Carolina. But more importantly, it had demonstrated that individual courage and determination, supported by effective institutions, could overcome organized criminal activity that had operated with impunity for decades. The restored Blackwood farmhouse now served not just as their family home, but as a symbol of possibility for other families facing similar challenges. Visitors came weekly, property owners seeking advice about mineral development, students researching individual rights and corporate power, and journalists documenting the ongoing impact of the Nakamura case. Your story has inspired legislation in 12 states, Professor William Hendricks explained during one of his regular visits to review the geological operations. The model you've created, individual property ownership, responsible resource development, and community benefit sharing, is being studied by policymakers throughout the country. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The Emperor of Japan, learning of Rosalind's success and her grandmother Emiko's role in preserving the family legacy, awarded her the Order of the Rising Sun for demonstrating the values of patience, courage, and family loyalty that represented the best of Japanese cultural heritage. Your great-grandmother's wisdom and your courage have honored not just your own family, but all families who preserve important knowledge for future generations, the Japanese ambassador explained during the award ceremony at the Japanese Embassy in Washington, D.C. As Rosalind prepared for bed in the master bedroom of the farmhouse that her grandmother had cleaned as a domestic servant nearly a century earlier, she reflected on the circular nature of their family's journey. Emiko had worked in this house, discovered the diamond deposits,
been sworn to secrecy, and spent decades preserving the knowledge that would eventually transform their family's circumstances. Rosalind had purchased the abandoned property, discovered the same diamonds, faced the same pressure to remain silent, but had possessed the resources and legal protections that allowed her to fight for recognition and development of the mineral wealth. Now, Keiko was growing up in the same house, attending the finest schools, receiving educational opportunities that would allow her to become anything she chose to be, while understanding the responsibility that came with inheriting wealth that had been earned through courage rather than luck. The most important lesson, Rosalind told Keiko as they reviewed the day's mining reports and foundation activities, isn't that we became wealthy. It's that we proved that ordinary people can overcome extraordinary opposition when they refuse to give up on what's right. And when they have help from good people, Keiko added, thinking of Professor Hendricks, Dr. Chen, Marshal Torres, and the dozens of federal officials who had protected their family and prosecuted their tormentors. And when they have help from good people who believe in justice and protecting families from criminal abuse. The final vindication came exactly 3 years after Rosalind's initial property purchase, when Fortune magazine published their annual list of America's wealthiest self-made women. Rosalind Nakamura ranked 47th, with estimated net worth of $78 million generated from mineral royalties and strategic investments. But the magazine article focused not on her wealth, but on her community development work and the legal precedents that had resulted from her refusal to surrender to criminal intimidation. The Nakamura case represents a unique American success story, the article concluded. Individual determination, effective federal institutions, and responsible resource development combining to create prosperity that benefits entire communities rather than just individual families. The woman who had been called stupid for buying worthless land had become a symbol of intelligent resistance to organized criminal activity, responsible wealth management, and community development that honored both family legacy and public benefit.
The brass key that had unlocked Charles Whitmore's safe in the original story framework now sat in a place of honor in the restored Blackwood farmhouse. Not because it had opened any literal vault, but because it represented the metaphorical key that Emiko's patience and Rosalind's courage had provided to unlock generational wealth and community prosperity. On quiet evenings, when the mining operations were silent and the mountains surrounding Thornfield County glowed with sunset light, Rosalind would sometimes walk to the lightning-struck oak where she and Keiko had first discovered the unusual stones that would transform their lives. The tree still stood, its split trunk reaching skyward like arms embracing possibility, its roots drawing sustenance from soil that contained some of the richest diamond deposits in North America. "Thank you, Grandma Emiko," Rosalind would whisper to the evening wind. "Thank you for keeping the secret until we were strong enough to fight for it." The story that had begun with a desperate single mother spending rent money on worthless land had concluded with federal legislation, criminal prosecutions, community development, and generational wealth that would benefit not just the Nakamura family, but hundreds of other families throughout Appalachian communities. Sometimes the most valuable discoveries are hidden in the most unlikely places, waiting for the right person with sufficient courage to claim them. The $400 farm that changed everything in the original story had demonstrated that in America, individual determination combined with effective institutions could still overcome organized criminal power, creating prosperity that honored both family legacy and community benefit. The diamonds that Emiko had called firestones now generated light that would illuminate opportunities for generations to come, proving that some secrets are worth preserving and some fights are worth winning regardless of the cost.
In the end, the greatest treasure wasn't the diamonds themselves, but the demonstration that ordinary people, armed with truth and supported by justice, could defeat extraordinary opposition and create extraordinary outcomes. The safe that had changed everything in the original story had been opened by a key preserved by someone with patience and wisdom. The farm that changed everything in this story had been unlocked by courage inherited from someone who had waited nearly a century for the right moment to reveal the truth. Both stories proved the same timeless lesson, that individual actions, taken at exactly the right moment with sufficient determination, can change not just personal circumstances, but the course of history itself. The mockery had been silenced. The critics had been proven wrong. The criminals had been defeated. And the woman who had been called stupid for buying a $400 farm had proven that sometimes the most ridiculed decisions become the wisest investments when they're made with courage, patience, and absolute refusal to surrender to forces that depend on fear for their power. The Firestones had finally emerged from hiding, and their light would shine for generations to come.